right, good morning, everybody. Thank you. It's very nice to be here. I often get a lot of anxiety at academic events because I don't feel like I fit in and I feel a little more comfortable here. So I want to thank you all for that energy. And I really appreciated that meditation in the morning that helped me get grounded. So thank you. Um, yeah, so my name is Josh Hanan. I'm a 5'6" male. I use he, him pronouns. I have short brown thinning hair, and I am wearing a gray patterned shirt with light brown khakis. So it's a real honor to be here today. I want to just start by thanking Angela Malloy for inviting me to be at this event. She's done a ton of work to put this on, and I'm very grateful to everything she's done to invite me and allow me to be part of this and all the work she's done for this conference. So thank you, Angela. And thank you, everybody, for being here. So my talk is titled Beyond the Deficit Lens, Disability, ADHD, and Neoliberal Biopolitics. In this talk, I'm going to begin by discussing the historical relationship between disability and dominant systems of power in the West, pretty brief, just to kind of provide an overview. I'll then discuss disability in the modern context of biopolitics and neoliberalism, which I'll be arguing throughout this talk plays an important role in shaping understandings of disability in the present historical moment. After establishing this context for understanding contemporary attitudes towards disability, I will move to a case study of attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, which I argue is a quintessential learning difference shaped by neoliberal systems of power. By neoliberalism, I'm referring to a political rationality that extends market principles into all areas of life, redefining individuals as entrepreneurial subjects responsible for maximizing their own productivity, health, and success within competitive systems. In this section, I will discuss how the history of neoliberalism correlates almost seamlessly with the evolution of ADHD as a recognized learning difference and explore a range of additional examples to argue that ADHD functions in tandem with neoliberal logics, particularly those that emphasize self-management, empowerment, and personal responsibility. Some of these examples come from my own life where ADHD operated at times as an external imposition or disciplinary mechanism, and later as a technology of self, a resource I mobilized to meet the demands of a highly competitive academic world. Other examples will come from popular culture where I will attempt to show how ADHD is framed almost entirely as a biological and neurological impairment that must be controlled and managed through neoliberal empowerment strategies and pharmaceutical interventions. I will conclude my talk by discussing possibilities for resistance to neoliberalism's influence on ADHD and thinking about resistance from a disability lens more generally. All right, so I'm going to start, and sorry, I realized I didn't give my preview slide. So I'm going to start by discussing historical perspectives on disability. So disability has a long history of being stigmatized, devalued, and viewed as a deficit in relation to dominant systems of power in the West, with varying degrees of acceptance and rejection throughout history. While ancient Greek myths sometimes reflected disability in their stories and narratives, with the story of Hephaestus being a particularly vivid example, the desired state in the ancient Greek world was able-bodiedness, and disabled people were rendered vulnerable, disposable, and precarious. This is an argument developed especially by J. Domage, among others. For example, in some city-states like Sparta, it has been documented that the infanticide of disabled babies and children were practiced. Likewise, in Athens, there was a strong emphasis on maintaining a physically and mentally, quote, perfect society. This is reflected in Plato's Republic, where he states, "The offspring of the good, I suppose they will take to the pen, to certain nurses who live apart in a quarter of the city, but the offspring of the inferior and any of those of other sorts who are born defective, they will properly dispose of in secret so that no one will know what has become of them." So this kind of exemplifies that logic. Let's talk now about early Christian views on disability. Disability became further stigmatized with the rise of early Christianity, as Beth Omansky and Karen Rosenblum observe in their essay, A Comparison of Disability with Race, Sex, and Sexual Orientation Statuses. Quote, biblical liturgy was historically used to frighten people into moral behavior and adherence to religious doctrine. Constructed as the punishment wrought by God on sinners, impairment became a metaphor for evil, immorality, and treachery. We can see this framing as well, for example, in Augustine's discussion of disability in the City of God, where he describes disability as the result of original sin and as straying from the teachings of God. He writes, quote, for the defects of the body, such as blindness and deafness, are not sins of the soul, but punishment of the first sin, end quote. Another prominent view among the early Christian period was what Leonard Davis calls the charity model. In this model, the disabled person was seen as someone to pity and help through charity, alms, and care. While this model had good intentions in many ways, it continued to present disability in theological and philosophical terms as a deficit. As Davis notes, quote, some thought that the sins of the parents were visited on the child. Others saw the disability as a test by God to give suffering and insight to the person and those around him or her. In either case, the disability was related to sin and the remedy was alms and prayer. Over time, especially as Christianity merged with imperial power under Constantine, this deficit-oriented framing of disability became further institutionalized. The association between disability and weakness, imperfection, or moral failure increasingly reflected dominant cultural ideals of strength, order, and divine perfection. While some Christian communities did care deeply for the vulnerable and founded institutions that modeled reciprocal care grounding in the healing ministry of Jesus, disabled people were still sometimes positioned as objects of pity or moral caution. In such contexts, those who exhibited traits of able-bodiedness were often aligned with the ideal human form, while those with disabilities were too often perceived as less complete, spiritually burdened, or existing on the margins of full humanity. We can thus appreciate here how disability from early on was symbolically overdetermined. Its meaning arose not on its own, but through its connection to a discursive web that aligned disability with fragility, weakness, animality, and even at times death, and able-bodiedness with perfection, godliness, vibrant life, and unchanging form. This symbolic framing has had real-world consequences for how disabled individuals have been treated throughout history. So now I'm just going to briefly move to the modern medical model. While disability has long been stigmatized, modern society has approached disability through more secular lenses that situate disability in biological terms. In this frame, disability is seen as a biological deficit or impairment that sometimes can be managed through proper medical practice and understanding. For example, in the 19th century, physicians such as John Langdon Down studied disabilities such as Down syndrome and recast its significance. Langdon argued that Down syndrome results from a fixed biological condition and needed to be treated at the level of science and medicine. While the medical model of disability thus redefined the cause of disability and in turn created space for disabled people to potentially be integrated into society, this framework continued to view disability through a deficit lens that defines disability as a deviation from a norm or ideal. This framing of disability in terms of deviation is made even more explicit in projects such as the work of Francis Galton, who developed eugenic theories and practices using statistical methods to pathologize disability. Thus, while the central frame for understanding disability might no longer center on sin, as it sometimes did in the past, moralizing logics persist in reconfigured forms. Disability continues to be often viewed as an aberration, whether spiritual, biological, or behavioral, that must be corrected or managed towards an idealized vision of the human body. All right, so finally, before getting to the neoliberalism stuff, I want to talk about the social model of disability. During the 20th century, especially the second half, attitudes towards disability became more complicated and more centered on the ostensible desires and experiences of disabled people themselves. While disability remains stigmatized, some scholars, such as Davis and Simi Linton, note the emergence of a new social model of disability. This model came to see disability as a construct that comes into existence through environmental, social, and cultural barriers. In this view, disability no longer carries with it the same sense of naturalized inferiority that it carried in the past. Earlier moral or charity models found across many ancient religious and cultural traditions often frame disability as a sin or moral failing. The modern medical model, by contrast, viewed disability as a deviation from a biological norm or ideal. The social model, finally, reframes disability instead as a constructed product of culture and society. The social model thus seems like a break with older models of disability and marks a move toward a view that resonates with my own position in this talk, that the deficit logic that often structures the meaning of disability is a product of social, cultural, historical, and technological forces. However, I want to offer an alternative perspective on the rise of the social model of disability than the one narrated by Davis and Linton. While acknowledging the many benefits of this model, I also identify other motives that underpin the development of this framework, which are themselves shaped by culture, society, and history. Okay. Can everybody hear me okay? All right. All right. Sorry about that. All right. There we go. Adopting a Foucauldian approach, rather than see the social model of disability as a radical break from previous forms of power, I'd like to argue in this talk that it emerges out of a modern context that Foucault calls biopolitics. More specifically, I want to argue that biopolitics and neoliberal logic combine to frame disability through an economic lens that treats it as an object to be managed and governed by empowerment strategies targeting families and individuals. So it has this kind of personalizing logic where responsibility is weighted on the shoulders of the individual and family. Therefore, understanding Foucault's concept of biopolitics, especially its neoliberal inflection, is crucial in order to appreciate the meaning and distinct reality of disability as a contemporary cultural form and kind of understand the continuity of power between the past and the present. So what I'm going to do next is I'm going to provide an overview of biopolitics and then discuss its connection to neoliberalism, which I interpret, consistent with the work of Michel Foucault, as an inflection of biopolitical logic. So for me, neoliberalism and biopolitics are intertwined. All right, so what is biopolitics? In numerous projects, especially Society Must Be Defended, Security, Territory, Population, and the History of Sexuality, Foucault developed the idea of biopolitics as a distinctly modern form of power. He argued that unlike sovereign power, which up until the 17th century was the dominant form of power, biopolitics sees life in a new way. Whereas sovereign power focused on the right to take life or let live, a logic which helps explain why many disabled people were outright murdered or killed prior to the modern moment, biopolitics emphasizes, quote, the right to make live or let die, end quote. This new form of power is, quote, bent on generating forces, making them grow, and ordering them, rather than one dedicated to impeding them, making them submit, or destroying them, end quote. That's from the History of Sexuality. According to Foucault, this modern form of power takes two main forms. The first form works according to a logic of disciplinary power that focuses on the individual as a cellular unit of power. This logic of power sees the human body as a machine and is focused on, quote, its disciplining, the optimization of its capabilities, and the extension of its forces, end quote. It works through disciplinary institutions that apply behavioral modification techniques, first developed in prisons and the military, to all aspects of society, including schools, hospitals, workspaces, and even home life. Its primary objective is to make the individual perform and behave in a way that requires minimal intervention from traditional coercive forms of power, generating what Foucault calls docile bodies that internalize power and control. The second form of biopolitics centers on the population, or what Foucault calls, quote, the species body. At the level of the species body, power is indifferent to individuals and is concerned primarily with statistical and aggregate conceptions of biological life that can be understood in terms of their health, tendency toward disease and sickness, and ultimately their optimization. From this vantage, power's main focus is various targets tied to societal growth and productivity. Quote, propagations, births and mortality, the level of health, life expectancy, and longevity, and all the conditions that can cause these to vary, such as pandemics. That's a quote from Foucault again in The History of Sexuality. Foucault links the emergence of modern biopolitics with capitalism and the economy, arguing that from a biopolitical perspective, the state is most interested in the controlled management of populations in order to serve the aims of economic growth and development. This turns government and state power into a distinctly economic project, where the aim becomes less about individual command and more about managing populations to ensure they are healthy, productive, and living up to their economic potential. All right, sorry, I'm just gonna take a quick drink here. The government itself also comes to be conceived in explicitly economic terms. The government must operate efficiently and optimally so that society can function effectively and the economy can continue to grow. Under this form of power, then, it no longer makes much sense to fully exclude or eliminate people that have historically been devalued in society, such as people with disabilities, even those who might not be viewed as productive or useful relative to the dominant ideal or norm. Rather, from a biopolitical perspective, it makes the most sense to integrate everyone into society and get them to manage their ostensible, quote, deficits and impairments, quote, in relation to certain targets and ideals that are determined by state forces and diverse and diffuse governing agencies. Hence, I would argue that it is only in light of biopolitics that we can fully make sense of both the medical model of disability and the more recent social model. Through the move toward biopolitics, disability came to be redefined in relationship to a statistical ideal. And while the social model gave more agency to disabled people to define disability in their own terms, it has and continues to operate within a framework that is also about keeping populations alive for the purpose of capitalist growth, reproduction, and accumulation, though this does not negate the genuine gains of the social model. So I'm not saying it's a bad thing, I'm just saying that it also operates within the context of biopolitics. Understanding the social model in relation to biopolitics, however, is not enough. We also need to appreciate this model's relationship to a particular form of biopolitics that Foucault calls neoliberalism. This connection is discussed most extensively in Foucault's lectures at the Collège de France, titled The Birth of Biopolitics. Has anybody read this text by chance? Okay, so yeah, it's a really interesting year-long lecture that he delivers, and it's all about the connection between biopolitics and neoliberalism. All right. As Foucault argues in his Birth of Biopolitics lectures, to fully understand biopolitical power, one has to appreciate liberalism and neoliberalism. Liberalism enters the scene around the same time as biopolitics, and according to Foucault, centers on the question of how to govern through human freedom, both via the market and via a frugal state that doesn't intervene too much. Like biopolitics, liberalism presumes, as Mitchell Dean notes, quote, a non-political dimension of existence governed by processes that are autonomous from the operation of sovereign authority, end quote, such as economy, population, and family. Liberalism is also concerned with the question of how to govern minimally. Neoliberalism, as it emerged during the second half of the 20th century, intensifies the logic of liberalism. It argues for further reducing the role of the state in society and dismantling social structures that stifle what Friedrich Hayek calls, quote, the spontaneous order of the market. It also, as Foucault notes, seeks to, quote, introduce the general principles of the rule of law into economic legislation. So these are some key features of neoliberalism. One other feature is human capital. So neoliberalism encourages humans to think of themselves in terms of what Gary Becker defines as human capital. The idea that individuals are agents responsible for managing their own productivity and success based on the resources they are given by society and family. From the perspective of human capital, each individual has value based on numerous factors, including their genetics, such as their height, physical appearance, etc., their education, their nationality, and additionally, things such as the disabilities an individual does or does not have. It's a very cold, economic, calculative way of looking at individual people. This view leads to problematic evaluations of human worth, and yet Foucault argues that it is a very prevalent attitude and orthodoxy among neoliberal societies. From the vantage of human capital, humans must essentially make the most of the cards they are dealt, and they do this by how they relate to a marketplace of choices. If people are, quote, wise, end quote, they will seek out self-empowerment and invest in practices and behaviors like getting certain forms of education that grow their human capital. We see this discourse a lot in higher ed right now with the whole idea that getting a humanities education is a bad investment, right? Not a good use of your human capital. Human capital thus encourages thinking of individuals as what Foucault calls homo economicus, or economic man, a person who understands all problems, even non-economic ones, as individual challenges to be managed through personal effort and cost-benefit analysis, rather than as structural issues to be addressed collectively as a society. All right, let's talk briefly about neoliberalism's rise. While Foucault's account of neoliberalism locates the emergence of this logic in Austria and Chicago between the late 1940s and the late 1960s, most scholars consider the birth of full-fledged neoliberalism to be in the early 1980s, with the election of Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, which occurred shortly before Foucault's death. He died in 1984. Yet Foucault's understanding of neoliberalism as central to biopolitics was incredibly timely and has only become even clearer in the aftermath of his passing in the 80s. Since the 1980s, neoliberalism has moved increasingly from a conceptual project to one that is grounded in everyday practices, rituals, and social institutions. Whether appreciated in terms of the Washington Consensus that developed in the 1990s, where both Democrats and Republicans both promoted a neoliberal agenda, the rise of disaster capitalism in the early 2000s, documented most extensively by Naomi Klein, or the most recent effort by the Trump administration to privatize education, neoliberalism remains more pervasive than ever, and its effects are both collective and individuating. Moreover, while some argue that the Trump administration marks a return to nationalist and authoritarian forms of government and a movement away from neoliberal globalization, scholars such as Wendy Brown have made clear that authoritarian tendencies can easily exist alongside neoliberalism, with the state operating as a violent instrument for market fundamentalism. In the realm of disability specifically, I would like to argue that neoliberalism has led to a paradoxical effect. On one hand, it has led to calls for the erosion of state-supported welfare programs that were developed in the aftermath of World War II to support people living with disabilities. It has also framed disability as a personal problem, pushing back against some of the advances made by the social model of disability. Yet on the other hand, neoliberalism has transformed culture, creating the right conditions for a movement that is centered on, quote, the self-empowerment, end quote, of disabled people. Over the past 30 years, especially with the rise of the internet, there have been countless resources dedicated to overcoming the limitations of disability and becoming successful in spite of disabilities, which aligns more broadly with what has come to be known as self-help culture. This is particularly the case with learning differences. In neoliberal societies, countless books about learning differences and mechanisms for coping with them exist, and schools have become increasingly adapted to accommodating students with learning differences and making sure they can integrate fully into our society and culture. It's within this context of biopolitics and neoliberalism, then, that I would argue many contemporary views and attitudes about disability emerge. And I believe that it is important to appreciate this logic when thinking about disability in the present historical moment. I believe this is particularly the case when it comes to learning differences. In the past 40 years, we have witnessed a significant proliferation in the diagnoses and treatment of learning differences. And while there are certainly numerous explanations for this development, I would argue that neoliberalism is one key aspect. In a world where social safety nets have disappeared and individuals are expected to take full responsibility for their own success or failure in society, diagnosing and managing learning differences as a lifelong problem and process aligns with the goals of neoliberal power structures. This way of thinking about learning differences is consistent with Foucault's perspective, I would argue, and specifically what he describes in the History of Sexuality, Volume 1, as the, quote, modern incitement to discourse, end quote. As he shows in this text, the proliferation of discourses around sexuality in the 19th and 20th centuries was not an act of liberation against repression, but the workings of a biopolitical form of power that was concerned with the governance and management of the human population, with the primary aim of being reproduction. He states, for example, that, quote, we must not think that by saying yes to sex, one says no to power. On the contrary, one tracks along the course laid out by the general deployment of sexuality. So he's kind of arguing that we've had a proliferation of diverse sexual identities in the 19th and 20th century, and that's not simply a reflection of people's true desires and pleasures, but also a system of power. It's both at the same time. Building upon this insight by Foucault, I'd like to argue that the growing discourse around learning differences over the past 50 years reflects not just increased awareness, but also a new form of social control that centers neoliberal norms of productivity, efficiency, and self-optimization, and pathologizes divergence in relationship to these norms. In other words, diagnostic labels like ADHD and autism, while certainly reflecting real experiences and proving helpful for many people, are partially the effect of living in a neoliberal society that emphasizes constant productivity and focus, individualization, and self-empowerment, norms that are taken as natural rather than products of late capitalist culture and society. I am thus nuancing the social model of disability perspective. While I agree with key tenets of the model, for example, that disability is constructed and the product of social, cultural, and environmental barriers, I am arguing that this contemporary lens is itself compatible with neoliberalism and shaped by it. Insofar as contemporary biopolitical society views deviations from the norm as problems to be fixed and managed, it sets up a situation where disability is both accepted and simultaneously figured as a deficit in need of cure and correction. I realize that my claims here may be provocative for some, and I want to be clear at this point. I am not suggesting that learning differences do not exist or that people's experiences with them are not real or challenging. I fully recognize that they are. I know that from my own experience. What I do want to propose in this talk, nevertheless, is that learning differences are not simply neurological or biological facts, but also effects of broader social, cultural, institutional, and technological forces, which under neoliberalism shape how we experience and perform cognitive difference in increasingly managed and optimized ways. So I'm saying they're kind of co-constitutive. Neoliberalism and learning differences emerge in relation to one another in a certain way. An additional consequence of my proposal is that what might be seen as a deficit in one culture, particularly a neoliberal one that elevates productivity and efficiency as its highest values, could in another context be seen as a gift, a view I do not think is often fully appreciated in our culture, nor fully fleshed out when the social model of disability is discussed. And I'll talk more about the gift toward the end of my presentation. All right. Another crucial aspect of my claim here is what I would call the self-fulfilling prophecy effect of learning differences. By identifying with the learning difference, we often adopt the identity associated with that label, reinforcing at times a deficit-based perception of ourselves that motivates us in turn to align our behavior with neoliberal norms of productivity and efficiency. Judith Butler would describe this in terms of the performance of identity. Just as they argue in their book, Gender Trouble, that gender identity is performed through the repeated enactment of social norms, I would argue that both neurotypicality and non-neurotypicality are enacted through the repetition of our everyday interactions with various people, from family and friends to teachers and students in the classroom to managers and colleagues in our workplaces. If non-neurotypical, our interactions with people designed to accommodate our learning differences also become central to our identity performance, whether those people be therapists and psychiatrists, resource specialists, or coaches. It's through the everyday interactions that we perform the disabilities that we identify with. I would also want to extend this claim further to disability more generally. While I do not want to deny that physical disabilities can be genuinely limiting and sometimes painful, part of what makes them this way is the social, cultural, and environmental context that people live under, which often stigmatizes disability and creates situations that make it challenging to live with disability. For example, if we lived in a society built around the principles of universal design, aspects of the built environment that seem like a hurdle to some people, such as walking upstairs if mobility is limited, would be different. Likewise, if we regularly had classrooms that were designed for neurodiverse students, instead of designing the classroom in the image of a normal and standardized subject, performing neurodivergence would feel different as well. And yet, I also want to recognize that these realizations are compatible at times with neoliberal society. For years, discourses of universal design and inclusive excellence have been discussed at various neoliberal institutions, including schools, universities, and workplaces. While many corporations see incorporating these practices as too much of an ask, and the Trump administration, of course, has pushed back against them, which is awful, we need to also appreciate that while inclusive excellence and universal design are positive things, they are capable of being integrated into the logics of neoliberal capitalism without substantively changing the structure of these underlying systems. And as many of us with disabilities have found, when these programs are pushed too far, such as using them to question the underlying structure and landscape of capitalism itself, which from my perspective is fundamentally ableist, their capacity to work within the logics of neoliberalism and ableism become clear. So we see that sometimes. Additionally, while neoliberalism devalues people with disability and often articulates these people through a deficit lens, it also, as I mentioned earlier, embraces an empowerment lens that encourages people with learning differences to effectively cope, whether that's through therapy, self-help, or other strategies, in order to effectively function and assimilate within mainstream society. So I am arguing for a nuanced perspective on neoliberal capitalism that sees it both as a social context that constructs disability and as a framework that allows for the proliferation and management of disability, especially learning differences. Put another way, my position is that disability is constructed, but it's not constructed in a vacuum, nor can it take on meaning freely. Rather, the experience of disability always arises in relationship to social systems and power relations. And this remains true in a neoliberal context that often fetishizes discourses of difference, self-expression, and empowerment. All right. Let's move on now to the case study. So having established this theoretical framework, I'd like to now get more concrete and focus on a particular learning difference within neoliberal society, ADHD. I am interested in ADHD not only because it is one of the most commonly diagnosed learning differences in our society, but also because I have personally been diagnosed with ADHD throughout my entire life. As a child, I was diagnosed with ADHD, then called ADD, because ADHD wasn't a term yet, at the age of 8, and placed on various stimulant medications for supposed depression and also issues related to focus and emotional regulation. I was also placed in numerous schools for children with learning differences, including the Winston Academy in middle school and the Futures Academy in high school. I repeated fourth grade, was bullied regularly in elementary and middle school, and felt throughout most of my childhood like a failure and a reject. As an adult, I was re-diagnosed with ADHD in graduate school and returned to taking stimulant medications, this time by choice rather than by force, in order to try to do better in school. Since graduate school, I have gone back and forth with various ADHD medications. And after nearly a 10-year hiatus from stimulant meds and achieving both tenure and full professor in the process, I recently started back up on them. This time around, I didn't take stimulants primarily to help with focus, but rather to aid my skills with emotional regulation as a parent with 2 little kids, one of whom has traits that some might be tempted to label ADHD. So I'm still debating whether it's helping or not, but yeah, that's what scares me the most is after having roughly half a lifetime to reflect on my own experience with ADHD, and after working with many students who have this learning difference, I have concluded that the ADHD experience is influenced by neoliberalism and biopolitics. I will offer a few forms of evidence to support this claim for the remainder of my presentation. First, I'll briefly discuss the history of ADHD, highlighting how its development as a diagnosable learning difference evolved almost perfectly alongside the historical evolution of neoliberal capitalism. Second, I will turn to a series of brief case studies that explore how ADHD operates in relation to neoliberal logics of personal responsibility, self-optimization, and productivity. These include reflections on my own experiences with ADHD as both a child and adult, where I argue that ADHD functions, especially in adulthood, as what Foucault calls a technology of the self. While my early experiences were shaped primarily by institutional forms of discipline, I gradually came to internalize these frameworks, eventually governing myself through the same logics I had once resisted. I will also discuss how these dynamics show up in ADHD self-help literature, online ADHD communities, and broader self-help culture context that, while offering support, often reinforce neoliberal norms. So I'm going to look at like several different case studies. My line of argumentation in this part of the talk derives in part from a previous essay I have published called Subjects of Technology and Auto-Archaeology of Attention Deficit Disorder in Neoliberal Times. And I'd be more than happy to share that with anybody that's interested. I published that back in 2019. And my hope is to develop some of these lines of analysis further in a future book project that explores the relationship between biopolitics, neoliberalism, and ADHD. All right, let me just put this. All right. While for hundreds of years in medical literature, children have been described as distractible and hyperactive, the first official recognition of ADHD as a diagnostic category occurred in 1968 with the publication of DSM-2. At this time, the diagnosis was not called ADD or ADHD, but hyperkinetic reaction in childhood. While there are many possible reasons why ADHD emerged as a behavioral pattern worthy of psychiatric classification at this time, One possible explanation is that it served as a tool for aligning the next generation of children with the values of an emerging neoliberal society. While neoliberalism was not yet an established doctrine in 1968, the ideas behind this way of governing society were already formally developed. As I mentioned earlier in his Birth of Biopolitics lectures at the Collège de France, Foucault notes that the foundational ideas of neoliberalism were formed by the Montpellier Society in the late 1940s in Austria, and later in the 1950s expanded by the Chicago School of Economics throughout and also throughout the 1960s. Another related explanation might have to do with a growing need to legitimize the use of stimulant medications. Since the 1930s, stimulant drugs had been known to enhance focus and were approved by the FDA. Creating hyperkinetic reaction of childhood as an official diagnostic category in the DSM provided a clear pathway to prescribe these drugs to children in ways that could increase attention, focus, and productivity. This need was especially in demand with the rise of the modern educational system, which sought to teach children using a standardized curriculum that assumed all children learn in a similar fashion. A further possible reason for the emergence of ADHD at this time is the backlash against the counterculture movement of the 1960s. The counterculture movement of the 60s rejected conformity and promoted psychedelic drug use as a means of consciousness expansion. ADHD diagnoses offered a way to resist these trends by encouraging individuals to function within normative social structures, even if they struggled, and by promoting a drug regimen in contrast to psychedelics that align brain chemistry with the values of discipline, focus, and productivity. So it's a much more socially acceptable drug to consume. None of these expectations alone is sufficient to explain the emergence of ADHD as a diagnostic category. I'm not trying to say that these circumstances caused it. I am trying to say that they were likely contributing factors to its overdetermined appearance as a social and medical problematic. The case that ADHD was shaped by the historical evolution of neoliberalism becomes even more compelling when we consider its redefinition as ADD. All right. Ahead of myself. At the beginning of the 1980s, the term ADD was officially introduced in the DSM-3, which included two primary variants, with hyperactivity and without hyperactivity. The timing of ADD's emergence in its modern form aligns strikingly well with the rise of neoliberalism. As many of you know, the early 1980s marked a significant shift toward neoliberal ideas and a retreat from the social welfare state that had dominated much of the post-World War II period. In 1979, this shift was led by Margaret Thatcher in the UK, and in 1981, a similar turn began in the United States with the election of Ronald Reagan. Neoliberalism in the 1980s emphasized market discipline and viewed the market rather than the state as the primary driver of societal transformation. It rejected government-funded safety nets such as welfare and disability support and emphasized personal responsibility, family values, and self-empowerment. These logics have persisted into the present and have become especially pronounced under the rhetoric of the Trump administration. The 1980s were also when I was personally diagnosed with the quote-unquote disorder. Based on interviews I have conducted with my mom, she recalls that the diagnosis had a kind of aura and novelty around it at the time. It was sort of the cutting-edge way to understand a variety of children that didn't fit in, especially in school context. It was seen as a breakthrough in behavioral research and a new way of understanding abnormal childhood development. It was also seen as a promising set of tools for managing problematic kids that had fallen through the cracks in the standardized educational system. In the 1990s, ADD was redefined and relabeled in the DSM-4 as attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, now with three distinct subtypes: inattentive, hyperactive, and combined. So we're over here in the 90s. All right. Although I was not re-diagnosed during this time, I would later come to understand that my particular type of ADHD was the inattentive subtype. So that's what I identify with now. The development of this more granular way of understanding ADHD coincided with the height of neoliberalism, a period often referred to as the Washington Consensus, which I mentioned earlier, when both major political parties, Democrat and Republican, embraced market fundamentalism and globalization. The increasingly detailed subtypes of ADHD also mirrored the demands of a specialized knowledge-based economy where individualized cognitive performance became paramount. So there's more of a catering to different niches of ADHD, which for me is kind of a parallel logic to what Foucault says about sexuality. Through different ADHD subtypes, individual children could be more effectively targeted and given a unique regimen of medication and behavioral therapies that supposedly worked for them based on their particular disposition. Much like Foucault's discussion of sexuality in the modern moment, where diverse forms of classification become a tool of power and governance, the expansion and refinement of ADHD subtypes allowed for more precise forms of control and intervention across different populations. From a Foucauldian lens, diverse sexualities and expressions of ADHD proliferate not because they express the true nature of our inner desires and passions, but because they allow for more complex forms of control that can subject a wide range of populations to biopolitical and disciplinary surveillance. It's with this insight in mind that we might appreciate how ADHD was further refined in the DSM-4 at the beginning of the 21st century. The three main subtypes were maintained, but the diagnostic criteria were expanded and clarified. This time frame continued to reflect a period of deepened neoliberal entrenchment. For example, President George W. Bush's No Child Left Behind Act of 2002 emphasized standardized testing and school accountability, placing even greater pressure on teacher and parents alike to think of student performance in terms of test scores. Policies like No Child Left Behind created an environment where neurodivergence could be viewed as a failure to meet increasingly rigid academic benchmarks, leading to more diagnoses and more pharmaceutical interventions. In 2013, ADHD was updated again in the DSM-5. The age of onset was raised from 7 to 12, and the criteria for adolescents and adults were further refined. This update came in the aftermath of the 2008 financial crisis, at a time when neoliberalism was increasingly criticized, yet its logic remained embedded in everyday institutions and norms. The more widespread and nuanced recognition of adult ADHD in DSM-5 also reflects a broader pattern: the pathologization of difficulty in adapting during adulthood to high-speed, high-demand, performance-driven adult life. So, it's a more recent thing to diagnose adult ADHD, and that's what I identify with now. But I think that mirrors, this hyper-competitive capitalist society that we've increasingly moved towards. To me, the parallel development of ADHD and neoliberalism is striking. While it's difficult to make any definitive causal claims, the close historical entanglement of the two developments suggests, in my view, more than a coincidental relationship. Yet there are other sources for understanding the connection between ADHD and neoliberalism as well, some of which come from my own lived experiences as a child and adult diagnosed with ADHD, and others which come from reflecting critically on discourses about ADHD in popular culture. As a consequence, I'm going to conclude the presentation by discussing some of these additional pieces of evidence. After sharing this material, I will end by reflecting on some of the ways resistance to the neoliberal governance of ADHD can be enacted. All right, so let's talk about my personal experience with ADHD. The first place for further reflection on the relationship between neoliberalism, biopolitics, and ADHD is in my own life. As I mentioned earlier and have described at length in my auto-ethnographically informed essay, Subjects of Technology, I was diagnosed with ADHD as a child and again as an adult. When I was a child, ADHD felt more like an imposition than a diagnosis I chose for myself. I experienced the diagnosis as a form of discipline that felt like it was trying to generate a docile subject at the expense of my unique and singular way of being in the world. Much of my memories from this time consist of being evaluated and judged by teachers, parents, psychiatrists, and peers at school. I remember being forced to take medication at various points against my will and being regularly bullied and teased. I remember repeating fourth grade after spending a year at two private schools that seemed ill-equipped to deal with my presence. And I remember the conflicting messages that I was both gifted and deficient in various aspects of my life. In my Subjects of Technology essay, I argue that my relationship with ADHD emerged in relationship to these experiences. In other words, I developed my earlier claim in this talk that ADHD is performatively enacted, and that in some ways my early childhood experiences created the very deficit framework that characterized living with ADHD. Through all the interventions, medications, and behavioral modification techniques, I came to the self-realized conclusion that I was not a normal person within society and that I didn't fit within the mainstream. Being a kid diagnosed with ADHD made me feel different in a way that both limited my identity and shaped the forms of identity and identification that I would gravitate towards as I got older. In high school, for example, my identification with being, quote, non-normal, end quote, and at odds with the mainstream led me to join the punk scene and become a vegan anarchist punk rocker. I don't know if anybody else had that experience, but it would be cool if there was somebody else who had a similar path. But let's see, I lost my place with that. I participated in protests and activism during this time and actively sought to embrace countercultural ways of being in the world, ones that were critical of the mainstream and authority figures. This rejection of mainstream society also led to a problematic view that school wasn't a place I excelled in, and led me to view the process of getting an education as something I had to survive through rather than something I could enjoy and be passionate about. In college, my attitude towards education shifted significantly after being exposed to the work of Michel Foucault in a rhetoric class. I had never heard of Foucault before, but his critique of society and his emphasis on the normalization and discipline of bodies immediately resonated with me. Through this connection, I was able to turn my identification with being a non-normative anarchist punk into a passion for studying rhetoric and Foucault. And that's kind of the path that got me to where I am today delivering this talk. But things became more complicated when I went to graduate school with the dream of becoming a rhetoric professor. At this point, I realized that being passionate about studying Foucault and critical theory was unfortunately not enough. If I wanted to continue the line of work I was doing, I'd have to compete in a highly selective academic environment where only 20 to 30% of graduate students were awarded tenure-track jobs. At this point, I felt an intense pressure to publish or perish. I knew that my career in academia would depend on producing publications, and I really started to struggle with the fact that I had not received a good education during childhood and adolescence. My disidentification with school as a kid and as a teen in high school was coming back to haunt me. And I had to figure out a way to excel in higher ed despite my upbringing and earlier challenges with standardized education. This situation ultimately led me to get re-diagnosed with ADHD in graduate school and prompted me to go back on stimulant medications. I hadn't taken them since I was probably 10 or 11. And I didn't like them back then. But this time in graduate school, I felt they gave me an edge, something that would help me succeed and be more productive as a struggling graduate student. The combination of my desire to succeed in academia and the effect of Adderall unfortunately led me to embody many of the qualities of Foucault's enterprising neoliberal subject while I was in graduate school. And I talk about this a lot in my essay. Sorry, okay, I found it. I emphasized productivity around the clock and became fixated on academic output. That fixation ultimately helped my career. I did, in fact, eventually get a tenure track job, and I am now speaking to you as a full professor at DU. Thank you. That means a lot. It was not an easy process. But there were significant psychic consequences to this way of looking at the world, and many of my relationships were damaged as a result of my desire to be productive no matter the cost, and this still affects me to this day. It's because of these experiences that I framed ADHD in my subjects of technology essay as a technology of the self. As an adult, ADHD became a resource I returned to out of my own choosing, not because I fully believed the label described my unique experience, but because it was a way to help me cope in a very high-pressure academic environment that was largely driven by the imperatives of neoliberalism. Everything from the self-help regimens I adopted to the medications I took acted as technologies of the self, shaping my desires and embodied orientation toward the world, a world increasingly defined by the need for productivity and success within academia. These desires didn't just come naturally to me. They had to be continually generated and performed through a masochistic relationship with myself that involved fear, anxiety, and a relentless drive to get ahead as some of its basic components. I see the irony in a critical theory-oriented rhetoric professor adopting neoliberal mentalities to succeed in academia. It's definitely an interesting irony in my life. But unfortunately, academia is not separate or immune from the neoliberal society we live in. Academia, as I argue in the essay, is entrenched in neoliberalism and ableism, and the two work hand in hand to create a context where some neurodivergent scholars really have to struggle to get ahead. And, it's still, to this day, I just still don't feel at home in academia. I eventually decided during my time as an assistant professor to stop taking Adderall, and for a full decade went unmedicated. Just recently, this past fall, I went back on Adderall again, partially because of a struggle with focus and partially as a tool, like I said earlier, to aid my emotional regulation, especially around parenting. My current attitude toward Adderall is an ambivalent one. I see benefits to it, no doubt, as someone with the particular cognitive disposition that I have. But I also wonder how much I need the Adderall and how much I take it to cope with the unrealistic pressures of living in a neoliberal society. As a parent with 2 kids and a partner who is also a professor, it is challenging to ever turn off the background hum of needing to be productive. This ongoing desire for productivity warps my sense of time and continues to shape how I relate to myself and others. So my own experience is one powerful place for thinking about the connection between neoliberalism, biopolitics, and ADHD. But there are many other avenues as well, which I hope to explore in much more detail when I work on this book project down the road, which I'm hoping eventually I'll get to. All right. One of these additional avenues for thinking about the relationship between ADHD, biopolitics, and neoliberalism is mainstream books published on the subject that are targeted towards individuals who have been diagnosed with learning differences. When I encountered these books in graduate school with titles like "You Mean I'm Not Lazy, Crazy, or Stupid" and "Driven to Distraction," I was struck by how heavily these books leaned into the language of self-help, self-management, and self-care. ADHD was framed not so much as a neurological difference shaped by context, but as a personal obstacle to overcome. The message seemed clear. If you're struggling, there are strategies you can enact upon yourself to better cope with your learning difference. This framing, while genuinely helpful in many cases, should be appreciated in light of a neoliberal context that frames ADHD as a personal responsibility to be managed and pushes away discussions of how ADHD might arise from living in a certain type of world dictated by the everyday wisdom of market capitalism. The unsustainable context of the present historical moment, which places tremendous pressure on everyone to keep up with the Joneses and get ahead, is rarely questioned. And instead, the focus centers squarely on the individual who is encouraged to align with societal expectations. Medications are also regularly advocated for, and their stigma is erased. While this erasure of stigma can be good in many respects, as many people with disabilities find that medications are essential to their survival and well-being, in the case of ADHD, I feel like things are a little more complicated. ADHD meds are known by many to be a double-edged sword. For some, they make people feel more, quote, normal and, quote, regulated. But for others, including myself at various times, they can cause emotional blunting and self-alienation, while also inducing side effects like dehydration and insomnia. And on that note, I'm going to have a drink of water. The books on ADHD I have encountered rarely reflect thoroughly on the downsides of stimulant medications and are usually overly cheery and optimistic about them, reporting, for example, that stimulants are totally safe and low risk. They also rarely consider or reflect upon the cultural context that makes medication needed for people with ADHD. If we lived in a different culture that wasn't so focused on competition, productivity, and climbing ladders to economic success, stimulant medications for ADHD might not be needed as much. I also have to question the dopamine fix that people with ADHD are said to be lacking. Does this deficit stem solely from our biological and neurochemical components, or the fact that we live in an advanced, technologically mediated society that constantly demands stimulation and instant gratification? And there's a really good book on this topic called The Shallows by Nicholas Carr. He talks a lot about that context. The pressure to constantly modulate my affect, to be more productive, more focused, more emotionally regulated, didn't just come from within. It was echoed and amplified by these books. A third and related space where I see the connection between ADHD, biopolitics, and neoliberalism is self-help culture more generally. These days, there are countless ADHD coaches, YouTube influencers, and other content creators who offer tips and frameworks to help people with ADHD be as successful and productive as possible. While much of this advice has real value, I don't think it would exist in the same way if we didn't live in the culture we live in, a culture grounded in neoliberal ideals of self-optimization. So much of this advice, even when it's framed as neurodivergent friendly, still pushes the same basic message. You have to make yourself more efficient and more productive in order to succeed. It is rarely about challenging the systems that make life harder for people with ADHD, such as school, work, late capitalism. It's about finding ways to survive within them. This isn't a coincidence. It reflects a deeper influence of neoliberal thinking, where the burden is always on the individual to adapt, to perform, to keep up. If you're struggling, the implication is that you just haven't hacked your routine well enough, or you're just not using the right planner or app, which can be purchased conveniently through the market. I've felt this pressure myself, even in spaces that claim to be ADHD friendly. The focus tends to shift back to productivity. How do we get more done? How do we stop procrastinating? It's all still in the service of becoming a better worker, a better student, a better version of ourselves, but always within the same structures. Self-help becomes less about genuine care for ourselves and more about training our bodies to meet external expectations, no matter how exhausting or misaligned they are with our deeper values. A fourth and related place where I've seen ADHD reflect the logics of neoliberalism and biopolitics is on Reddit forums. As an adult, I've spent time on these forums looking for insights, community, and strategies to get through difficult periods. What stands out is how strongly users frame ADHD as grounded in genetics and biology, something hardwired and essentially medical. There is often a deep investment among many of the users in the idea that ADHD is a personal disadvantage rooted in brain chemistry, and that the disorder makes it harder than normal to function in our society, which it certainly does in a lot of ways. I've had long stretches where it felt like my brain was working against me. And reading other people's stories sometimes makes me feel less alone. But I've also noticed that many users are highly skeptical of claims that ADHD might have any socially constructed dimension. And they are even often skeptical of language about disability that grows out of critical theory. I noticed, for example, that in some subreddits, such as Reddit ADHD, which has over 2 million participants, you can even be banned by moderators for making arguments about the socially constructed nature of ADHD. And you can even be banned for using certain words like neurodiversity. So they're actually trying to weed that out. Yeah. One time I shared my subjects of technology essay on the forum to get feedback, and people accused me of being part of the problem. They felt the suggestion that power dynamics play a role in how ADHD is lived and understood, devalued the real struggles people with ADHD experience. My aim, as I hope has been clear enough in this presentation, is not to do this. I am not arguing that ADHD is merely socially constructed or that people with ADHD don't sometimes present real discrepancies in their brain scans or in their neurochemistry. What I am arguing is that ADHD isn't reducible to scientific, neurological, and biological framings alone, and that neoliberal capitalist logics often incentivize and promote these framings because they place the burden of having ADHD solely upon the individual. All right, so I'm going to wrap it up now. Now that I've talked about the ways ADHD and neoliberalism are connected in contemporary society, I want to close by exploring how ADHD can also offer a space for thinking about resistance. For Foucault, wherever there is power, there is resistance. And it is my belief that the subjugated knowledges that arise out of the experiences of disabled and neurodiverse people, including those with ADHD, provide a window into thinking about our neoliberal capitalist society and how it can be questioned and resisted. So I'll conclude this talk with a few brief thoughts on resistance that have developed out of my own desire to think critically about ADHD. First, I want to point out, as I have already alluded to at the beginning of this talk, that ADHD is not just a deficit, it's also a gift. This idea is not particularly novel, and several books in popular culture make this exact claim. But most of the literature that frames ADHD as a gift, I have found, ends up defining it in terms that don't break with the norms of neoliberalism, but rather sometimes entrenches them. For instance, some writing about the gift-like qualities of ADHD highlight the ability ADHD folks have to hyperfocus. This is certainly true in my experience. And it's one of the reasons I would argue that I've been able to succeed in academia. I can just sit there and read Foucault all day long and, get in the zone. Yet too often, the power to hyperfocus is valued because of its ability to make ADHD folks be productive and get lots done related to work. What I'd like to argue as a counterpoint to this is that the gift of ADHD goes beyond just being successful and doing well in our society. ADHD, in my view, creates the opportunity to practice what Jay Dolmaj in this book, Disability Rhetoric, calls metis, which is the Greek word for cunning intelligence. In my experience, people with ADHD often think outside the box and come up with solutions to various problems that might not be as visible to neurotypical populations. These solutions can be valuable not only in work-related contexts, but in social and familial contexts as well. While I tend to be forgetful, my partner often appreciates how I come up with unexpected connections and creative workarounds in our family life sometimes, especially in moments that require thinking on the fly. That would just be one example of metis. ADHD in my case has also made me a more empathic person. Because much of my life has felt like a challenge and a struggle, I empathize with others who have undergone hardship. Having a learning difference has also made me more sensitive to how power operates. Like standpoint epistemology suggests, because the dominant worldview does not reflect my own lived experience, I'm more attuned to how the dominant worldview is constructed and enforced. In this light, ADHD has not only deepened my appreciation of power, but also what Kimberly Crenshaw and many others call intersectionality. While my experience with ADHD has been far from smooth or seamless, living with this learning difference has allowed me to appreciate that my own unique positionality has insulated me from many of the challenges that come from living with learning difference. I can sometimes pass as neurotypical. As a white cisgender male from a middle-class background, I have been afforded opportunities in my life that someone from a different racial or socioeconomic background might not have experienced. While ADHD texts are often addressed to a universal subject who can improve their life through medication and self-help strategies, it's important to recognize that these insights land differently with different populations, many of whom do not even have the time or resources to engage with such lifestyle advice. Likewise, we should appreciate that while ADHD discourses risk marginalizing all people living with learning differences by centering a frame that serves neoliberal values and ideals, some experiences, such as those of Black and queer women with ADHD, are often marginalized in unique and compounding ways. As we talk more about neurodivergence in the context of neoliberalism, we must consider its intersectional composition. Disability has historically been aligned with deficit, and similar deficit-based framings have also shaped the meaning of other marginalized communities, albeit through different historical and cultural processes. We must build alliances among those whose bodies and minds have been devalued by dominant biopolitical systems and remain attentive to how power produces different subjects in unique ways. Okay. Related to some of the points discussed above, my critical engagement with ADHD and disability studies more generally has convinced me of the need to think beyond a logic of inclusion when advocating for neurodiverse and disabled folks. Inclusion is often presented as an unquestioned good, and often it is better than the alternative, but inclusion does not fully challenge systems that are rooted in oppression and structured to keep the status quo ultimately in place. Resistance to power from a disability perspective means challenging the underlying systems that frame disability as a deficit in need of framing and correction. It means creating new environments, pedagogies, and communities where difference isn't a problem to be solved, but a starting point for transformation. I have one other point that I'm going to skip because I'm running out of time. So I really appreciate everybody being here for my talk today and engaging with it. While I do not have all the answers for addressing the ableist society that we live in today, I believe that analyzing ADHD and potentially other learning differences as well through the lens of neoliberalism and biopolitics offers a powerful framework for understanding disability in our current moment. While ADHD clearly has biological and neurological dimensions, I've argued that its lived reality is also deeply shaped by neoliberal power structures and that this insight likely applies to other learning differences and physical disabilities as well. Neoliberalism, as Foucault notes, is a diffuse political rationality, and its market-centered orientation to reality impacts nearly every aspect of life. I've also suggested toward the end of my presentation that we move beyond deficit-based frameworks rooted in productivity, that when we move beyond these frameworks, ADHD and disability can take on new meanings and point towards social change and social justice. So thank you very much. Thank you. All right, and I apologize for going over.
Thank you so much, Josh. And friends, unfortunately, we don't have time for questions, but Josh will be around today, and you're always welcome to talk with him or send him an email at joshua.hanan@du.edu. Let's thank Josh again.
Yeah, I'll be around all day. I'd love to talk to any of you more about the topic, so I'll be around. Please talk to me.